Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for showing up. We're still waiting, I think, for people to show up from class, but we'll probably get started because we want to make sure we have time for questions. This is the second session that we've held, sponsored by the Department of Political Science, to talk about the election, and we are only, 6 days away? So it's really coming along. We'll be there very shortly. Our goal in presenting these sessions is to help you think about this election analytically, give you some perspective, not get too worked up, too upset, too anxious about what is happening. We have a series of speakers today from the Department of Political Science. We have Professor Drew Engelhardt, Professor Eric Gronendijk, Professor Stanley Feldman, Professor Brian Gay, and Professor Stephanie DeMora. Each of them is an expert in the different topics that they'll be talking about. They'll cover some basics, but if you have some really great questions, hold those for the end. Not everyone may be as up to speed about what's going on in this election. There's been a lot happening. So if you feel like, oh, I already know some of these things, ask that more sophisticated question at the end. So we will get started. Every speaker will have roughly about 10 minutes to present, and then we will open up for Q&A. So we will get started with Professor Eric Gronendijk, who will talk about partisanship in this election, and he's an expert on partisanship.
All right. Thank you folks so much for coming. I know there's a lot going on these days, and you've probably already heard a lot about the election, and there might be some burnout going on. So we appreciate all of you being here for our presentations. Should be fun and hopefully pretty informative. So as Dr. Huddy said, I'm going to kind of start with the basics. I'm going to talk about partisanship, and there's really nothing more basic than partisanship. Actually, I have to turn this on. And then the others are going to kind of build on top of, I think, what I have to tell you. So I think this will be sort of a nice foundation for our panel. So starting out with the basics, right? What is partisanship? This is certainly a term that you have heard a lot about, probably something you think you have a really good idea of, but political scientists actually think about this a little bit differently than a lot of people do. And we draw a very sharp distinction between voting for a party and identifying as a partisan. These are distinct ideas. So to vote for a candidate or a party is to express a preference, right? So it's something that is likely to be variable from election to election, or at least could be variable from election to election. A lot of people these days vote for the same party over and over again, but there was a time not all that long ago, some of us can even remember it, when people would vote for candidates from the other party quite regularly. So there is an important distinction to be drawn. So the way we think about voting behavior is that it's an expression of support for a party or a candidate in much the way that you're expressing a preference for a Ford versus a Chevy when you're buying a car, or maybe an Apple versus a Dell when you're buying a computer, right? You might buy 4 Fords in a row, but the next time you go to buy a car, you might really like the new model of the Chevy that's come out and say, you know what, I'm gonna go for a Chevy this time around, right? So it's just a preference that could be variable. On the other hand, when we think about partisanship as an identity, this is something very different, right? When you say, I identify as a Republican or I identify as a Democrat, it's an expression of who you are, right? Of your sense of self relative to other people. You're defining who you are in society. And this is usually developed through the process of socialization, and therefore it's typically much more stable than your voting preferences, right? So typically people are born into families, right, where people's parents are Republicans or Democrats, and it's not so much that you're making a choice, it's that you see what your parents are doing, and you get this idea that, well, I'm part of a Republican family, or I'm part of a Democratic family. You might live in an area where a lot of the other people you know are Republicans or Democrats. So it's more than just a choice, right? You're not just saying, you know, I think I'm gonna choose to call myself a Republican or call myself a Democrat. It's often part of who we are. It's developed really early in life, and it's connected to our sense of self. So you can think of this as more like team allegiance is something that we often use to describe this. If you're thinking about like being born into a family of Yankees versus Red Sox fans, right? This is a psychological divide between these people, that there's the sense that I'm part of a community if I'm a Yankees fan or Red Sox fan. It's not that I probably choose to be a Yankees fan because I like the way they play or the people on the team. It's that I'm born into a family of Yankees fans, and I'm told from birth that we're a Yankees family, right? So I think this is the better way to think about party identification, right? So you want to draw this important distinction between voting with a party and identifying with the party. So I think this is important to keep in mind when we're thinking about the election, because oftentimes we're saying, well, why won't people just change their minds, right? Why are people so stuck in their ways, so set in their ways when it comes to their party identification or their voting behavior? And I think it's important to think about this because they're not just changing their minds, right? They're also potentially changing their identities. They're not just changing their preferences, they're signaling who they are with their vote, and especially when they're talking about which party they identify with. So when we talk about changing candidates or changing parties, it's not just turning on that candidate or that party. It might feel like you're turning on your family or your friends because this is part of who you are, right? It's part of your community. It's part of your sense of who you are when you do these things. So it's important to keep in mind when we're thinking about why people do what they do, why they behave the way they behave when we're thinking about elections. So, oops, all right. So the other thing that I think, the other term that comes up a lot these days that you may have heard about, that you can't really talk about partisanship without exploring and thinking about, is polarization. So when we're thinking about partisanship, it's hard not to think about this, right? That we have this trend toward polarization that you've heard a lot about in the news. But again, people have a lot of different ideas about what it means for the electorate to be polarizing. So there are a lot of different conceptualizations and a lot of debates in the literature, but this graph really represents what most political scientists agree on. And this is what we call affective polarization. So the basic idea here is that the x-axis has time, and that people's feelings toward the two parties are on the y-axis. So you can see the two trends across the top. Those are Republicans' feelings about the Republican Party and the Democrats' feelings about the Democratic Party, and those are relatively flat and high, right? Over time, people have always liked their own party quite a bit. That's not too surprising. What might be surprising to people who aren't as old as some of us is that if you look back to the older days, when people were talking about the parties, they were saying, well, I really like my own party, but I kind of like the other party too. I think that they're good people. They care about making our country a better place, but I like my party even better. Over time, what's happened is those feelings have dropped through the floor, right? People have much stronger, much more negative feelings about the other party than they used to. But the question is why, right? Why? And this is one of the big things that political scientists have been exploring for quite a while now and trying to understand American politics. So one of the things that people are likely to jump to right away is that, well, people who dislike the other party must dislike the other party because they have extreme issue positions, right? Maybe it's just that we're becoming more divided as a people, and therefore we dislike each other more. Well, here are a few graphs that are going to probably raise some doubts about this. So on the left, we have Democrats' feelings toward federal spending on Social Security over time. Again, on the x-axis, we have time. On the left, we have Democrats. In the middle, we have independents. And on the right, we have Republicans. So I want to emphasize two things to take away from these graphs. One is that there's quite a bit of similarity between these graphs, right? When you look at the people who favor increased federal spending on Social Security, if you look across Democrats, independents, and Republicans, it doesn't look all that different. There are some differences, but they're not as big as you might expect. The other thing you don't see is much of a time trend, right? You don't see some massive polarization over time where Democrats and Republicans' attitudes on these issues are pulling apart, right? They look fairly similar. So it doesn't actually look like people's issue positions are changing all that much on this issue. And I'm going to show you on a lot of others as well. So this thing that seems like it must be intuitively true and people just assume it's true sometimes is that while people have stronger negative feelings toward the opposition party, it's not actually because their own positions are becoming more extreme. So here's another example, federal spending on crime. We see a little bit of a difference, maybe emerging in the last few years, but we see sort of a similar pattern, right? There isn't a clear time trend. There aren't really big differences between parties. How about agreeing or disagreeing with whether the US should be concerned with world problems, right? Again, we see something similar. We actually see a lot of agreement on disagreeing with this statement, right? A lot of people disagree with the statement across parties. We don't see a big partisan difference, and we don't see a really clear time trend. Well, you might say, well, okay, none of these issues get to the core of what partisans are about. Let's look at something more core to the difference between American parties. So let's look at whether people favor or oppose government efforts to reduce income differences. How about that? This is, there's nothing more core to the differences between parties and ideologies than this issue. You could argue. So here we do see a bigger difference, right? You can see that there's a pretty big difference in the distribution of opinion between Republicans and Democrats. But even here, I want to draw your attention to two things. One is the overlap, right? That yes, there are more Republicans who strongly disagree and more Democrats who strongly agree, but there are also a lot of other people with opinions that overlap in these. So the distribution of Republicans and Democrats overlaps, right? That there's an average difference for sure, but there are a lot of Republicans who think like Democrats and a lot of Democrats who think like Republicans on this issue. The other thing is that, again, there's no really clear temporal change that's going on, right? There's no clear trend toward extremity in these two parties. These differences that we see here in 2020 were the same that we were seeing in 2012. So there's not a really huge difference that seems to be emerging on this issue. So what are some of the other possible explanations? Well, if you expected a big difference, more evidence of polarization emerging in people's issue positions, you're not alone. And this might help to explain what we think is actually one of the clearer causes of partisan animosity. So why do people dislike the other party so much? Well, actually, it looks like what's going on is people are misperceiving what the other party believes quite often. Oh, thanks. All right. So here's an example that I think is a particularly good one of people misperceiving what the other party believes. So Democrats expect fellow Democrats to believe in democratic principles, and Republicans to believe in Republicans expect fellow Republicans to believe in Republican principles. But on both sides, they expect the other side to disagree with these things, right? Many Democrats expect Republicans to be against democratic principles, and Republicans expect Democrats to be against democratic principles. But when we look at their actual beliefs, this isn't true. Actually, almost everyone supports democratic principles in very large numbers. So it looks like it's this misperception of what's going on. The other thing that is driving polarization is actually at the elite level. That it's not that the public is becoming more divided, it's that our choices are becoming more divided. So what we actually think is one of the things that's actually clearly happening is that people just have clearer choices. And when you have clearer choices, you have stronger opinions. So I think I'm actually gonna leave off there because we have a lot of more speakers and I can talk about some of the other points that I was gonna make. But I'm gonna hand things over to Dr. Engelhardt to continue on, talk a little bit about polling. Yeah. Faster, sorry. There we go.
All right, so thank you, Dr. Gronendijk, for setting me up to talk about everybody's favorite topical, kind of like daily occurrence public opinion polling, right? So not a day goes by, it seems, without some new poll showing kind of like who's winning or losing, Harris or Trump. And I want to talk through kind of like how we can consume polls and why they're so prevalent. One of the reasons for why they're prevalent is that polls are a great way for us to learn how the world works, what other people think, right? If we were to go around, as the nice gentleman in this comic shows, and ask ask people that we encounter, for instance, whether they're going to vote for Harris or Trump, we might be misled, right? As this individual aptly knows, right? He doesn't meet the poll kind of like estimate of nobody liking to play in the street when he's also playing in the street, right? So our everyday experiences are a little bit misleading, so we do public opinion polling. So public opinion polling is basically trying to take a sample. Imagine going into Ben & Jerry's and trying to decide an ice cream to have, right? You have a lot of options in front of you. You take a little taste. That's what public opinion polling is doing. We're taking a little taste of the general public to learn what voters broadly care about and think about, right? So what I want to do is talk about kind of like the state of the race in terms of public opinion polls, and then also set up how to think about translating what we see with public opinion polling into election night, right? So the most recent New York Times Siena poll, their last national poll of the race, has Harris and Trump exactly tied at 48 points apiece, right? This is one estimate then of what the national public thinks. And we can think about polling as these individual snapshots, right? But imagine again, you're tasting the ice cream and you're like, wait, did I like A or B better, right? You might want to go again and take another sample from A. So we might want to think about not just taking seriously one public opinion poll, but think collectively about what public opinion polls together are telling us, which leads us to paying attention to what are known as polling averages, right? So polling averages are literally just combining together the results from lots of different polls, combining together lots of different samples of the same thing. Here, as of last night, so things might have changed this morning after I put together the slides, but maybe not given how flat these lines are. As of last night, the New York Times polling average, again, this is an average or combination of a bunch of different polls, has Harris ahead by 1 point. This is probably with rounding because they note it's actually Harris a little less than 1 point. So another way to think about this is that polls are better when we can combine a bunch of information across them because they're taking different little snapshots about what voters think, right? And another thing to keep in mind is that we're talking about national polling averages, but do we care about voters in California and Texas, or do we care about voters in Michigan and Pennsylvania, right? So one of the things to keep in mind too is that polls, and I'm gonna show this in a couple slides, while we have these national estimates, right, we really only care about what the Electoral College says, right, where the popular vote in the state provides certain electors who then actually provide those votes for the president, right? So these are our estimates of what the world looks like. On average, nationally, Harris has a knife edge lead, right? But this comes with what I'm going to suggest, a grain of salt that should be large, but one that is appropriate for us in thinking about what polls offer, right? So I want to highlight kind of like what polls can tell us and what they can't tell us, right? What they can tell us is they can provide an estimate. An estimate is a very important term here, of the recent past, right? It's not a forecast. So when I say estimate, again, we're taking a sample. We're taking a small taste to try to figure out what something looks like. We're taking a small taste of ice cream. We're taking a small taste of soup, some other food, to try to figure out how we should adjust our expectations. Polling is the exact same way. We're taking a small taste of what the electorate wants to do in terms of supporting one candidate versus another. To get this taste, though, it takes at least a day, maybe several weeks. So when we're talking about the recent past, these polls are conducted over a series of days, sometimes even a month, depending on how people are collecting these data, right? This is put together in a final number, and while Dr. Gronendijk reminded us that people aren't necessarily changing their minds through the election, people can change their minds, right? So one of the things that we cannot say with polls is what election day is actually going to look like. Fundamentally, people can change their minds between when they answer a poll and when election day happens. And they can change their minds not just about who they're supporting, but also whether or not they're even going to show up to vote, right? This even assumes that we get correctly the people on the phone answering an email, et cetera, to provide their opinions, right? People can just change, right? This difference, though, between what polls, we can think of now, like polls as a recent past cast versus election day as like our forecast, right? This discrepancy can lead to what's known as polling error, just discrepancies between what the public opinion polls are saying and what election day actually looks like. So the New York Times has cataloged these differences for the last several elections. Here in the figure on the screen, the dots are the polling average, kind of like what public opinion polls said the general public wanted, right? Where the triangles are kind of like what the actual election day tally looks like, right? So we've had a lot of discrepancies, but discrepancies of varying sizes over time. This is in part a function, right, of people changing their minds, choosing whether or not to turn out to vote, and in part, pollsters not reaching people who are going to vote and who might have unique opinions between the candidates, right? These are national changes, right? 2020, large miss relative to 2016, but we might remember 2016 being a much more surprising outcome than 2020, right? Surprising outcome in part because, again, these are national data, we might pay attention to state data, right? So if we focus on the top here, on the top rows in each of the panels, the top panels are comparing Wisconsin and Michigan, middle are Pennsylvania and Nevada, bottom are North Carolina and Arizona. These are all key battleground states this year, right? But if we look at the size of the arrows in 2020, the size of this miss between what public opinion is saying and relative to what the election day is looking like varies across these different states, in part because pollsters are facing challenges trying to figure out what the election day electorate, who's actually going to show up, is going to look like, and getting people on the phone, right? But you'll also notice too that the errors in polling look similar in Wisconsin and Michigan, and then Nevada and Arizona look similar, right? Wisconsin and Michigan, add in Pennsylvania, they are kind of like demographically similar. Nevada, Arizona, demographically similar. So we can think about polling as maybe being accurate for certain types of states relative to others, or at least more accurate, or at least in this case, more inaccurate. So how do we get to these inaccuracies though? So what I want to do in terms of wrapping up with my time is walk through hypothetically election polling, right? Imagine that we have a nice rectangular state here in red. Rectangular state looks kind of like Pennsylvania, so we'll just say that this is Pennsylvania, right? If we divide up the red and the blue, red will be voters for Trump, blue are going to be supporters of Harris. If we divide up everybody in this figure, we have Trump winning 53% to 47%. But we know that not every single person who has an opinion on candidates shows up to vote, right? If we divide up these opinions based on who's going to vote, which I've symbolized here in the circles, Harris is winning 54 to 46. Polls are seeking to try to identify this share by interviewing a subset of this red rectangle, right? We want to learn this 54% to 46% point. We want to get that in terms of support and also figure out who actually these voters are. So we can do this in part by taking a sample. Let's say we take a sample and this is highlighted in green, and we're trying to use everybody who's in green to learn about that big red rectangle. In green, we have an estimate of voters, so again, those circles, of 57% to 43%, right? A little overestimating support relative to who would actually vote in that red rectangle. We could take another sample, get a similar estimate, which is how we can have multiple polls from different entities providing a same response, right? We could take a separate sample and get a wildly different estimate. Separate sample here, right? Trump is winning 54 to 46. This doesn't mean that this is incorrect. It's just like we've talked to a subset of a big group. We've talked to a selection of the big red rectangle, right, to learn what the rectangle looks like. That is just by chance inaccurate based on the underlying characteristics. So far with these samples, I've assumed that pollsters are perfectly able to tell who's going to turn out to vote. Sometimes they do this by asking in a survey, how likely are you to turn out to vote? And they only look at everybody who says, I am definitely going to turn out to vote. But as I said, people can change their minds. Sometimes they will engage in what's known as statistical weighting, which is to take respondents' demographic characteristics and kind of like create a weighted average for that weighted support that looks demographically like what they think the final electorate will look like. Or they'll even do fancier statistical models to actually predict for each individual respondent on a 0 to 100 scale, how likely are you to turn out to vote? And then they'll use that to figure out who likely voters are, right? Figuring out likely voters can change this tally. Let's say that we take, these two respondents, and we have the pollster get these turnout estimates wrong. This Harris supporter is definitely not going to turn out to vote. This Trump supporter is definitely going to turn out to vote. If we get it wrong, though, look what happens to the margin. It flips. So part of one of the reasons we might see differences across pollsters in terms of what they're reporting is that they're just characterizing the likely electorate differently. And this can also lead to discrepancies between what the polls look like and what election day looks like. It's all down to reasonable choices about what the final electorate on election day is going to look like, right? So just to sum up, in the spirit of the season, yes, polls are a little spooky because there's a lot of error, things can go wrong, there's a lot of uncertainty. Again, I've characterized them as estimates, but I think that they're less spooky when we understand that errors can exist, even if we don't know what direction that these will go, right? Especially in today's set of elections where we have a lot of very close races, it's very easy, especially in a presidential election when we're awarding electoral votes relative to doing the popular vote, it's very easy for the final tally to be incorrect relative to the polls. But it doesn't mean that polls are incorrect or like polls are bad. They're our best way to understand what sorts of demographic groups voted for different candidates and to understand the other kind of like things that go into vote choice. We can observe that because of the secret ballot, and appropriately so. But polls, even if we can't get that final estimate correct, are still our best way to understand kind of like dynamics of vote choice and better understand why people are making the choices they do. So with that, I'll wrap and pass it on, and I'm looking forward to a good discussion at the end.
And I forgot to say, I'm the chair of the political science department, Leonie Huddy. Our next speaker is Brian Gay, but how many of you are planning to vote or have already voted? So those of you who haven't raised your hands, this is what I think Professor Engelhardt is talking about is, are you certain? Are you sure? This is the difficulty with the polls is you may not even be sure. Of those of you who didn't raise your hand, are you actually going to vote? Maybe something will happen. This is the difficulty that pollsters face. And one of the problems and challenges is to figure out who is actually going to show up on election day so that we count their views appropriately. So you need a little sympathy for pollsters as well, given some uncertainty out there. So next we have Professor Brian Gay talking about misinformation.
Hi. Yeah, so I do research on political misinformation, and so obviously now is a really exciting time. Unfortunately, it's something we have to talk about. So today I'll talk about election misinformation. And one of the things that I always try to remind myself when I'm thinking about misinformation is that it's not new, right? It's been around for a really long time, and this goes for election misinformation as well. So I was recently reading a book on John Adams, our second president, and I learned that during the election of 1800, which was extremely contentious and very, very polarized, John Adams supporters spread a rumor so that people wouldn't vote for Thomas Jefferson. And that rumor was that Thomas Jefferson was dead. And it's really hard to convince someone to vote for someone who's not alive, right? So this has been around for a long time. But what is new is online misinformation and online election misinformation. This stuff is way easier to create. Now with large language models and AI, ChatGPT, it's really easy to make convincing misinformation. Like you look back at the election misinformation in 2016 and what the Russians were spreading, and you look back at it, it looks very antiquated, right? You're like, is that really real? Like, how do we think that was real? Now it's extremely convincing. And so it's easy to create. And then on social media, it spreads like wildfire, right? A lie about Thomas Jefferson being dead might take weeks, right, to reach the whole country. Now it spreads extremely quickly. And we're already seeing this in 2024, right? These are some news headlines that I saw yesterday. We're seeing a couple things, but one of the biggest things is that a lot of this misinformation is about the election process and the ballot counting process specifically. And it's just become normalized that foreign governments are going to try to convince us that things aren't going well. Back in 2016, when Russia was spreading disinformation, they had a very clear goal in mind, right? Like they wanted Trump to win. Now you have China, you have Iran, and you have Russia, all trying to just spread kind of chaos and disorder and uncertainty about the election results, right? They don't want our democratic system to work extremely well. And so we're just seeing an influx of this misinformation from foreign governments and also from US citizens. And so just one example that was in the news yesterday, there's all these images and videos of fake ballots, right? And people throwing away ballots and throwing them in the woods, right? And a lot of this is just fake. And with deep fakes, right, using AI to make images that look like they're real, but like illustrations, not real things that happened, this is just going to get worse and worse. And so I think we're going to see a lot of this on election day and the days after the election. And I'll talk at the end a little bit about kind of what to expect and what we might start to see. And I think that one thing that we don't talk enough about, so I'm a political psychologist, I look at why people believe misinformation, but I think it's also important to recognize the role of people that we call elites, so members of Congress, presidential candidates, political pundits on the news. It used to be that there was this norm that you should tell the truth. And there still is to some extent, but it's quickly eroding. And so what happens when you have elites who are no longer bound by the truth, who have incentives to lie, that's where you get a lot of this misinformation being amplified. So it used to be that even with online misinformation, that some bad actor posts misinformation online, right? Let's say that they create a post on Reddit or Facebook. That's going to circulate in their echo chambers, right? It's going to circulate among people, their friends and followers on social media. But in large part, it would kind of stop there, right? You would get these communities that were really aggressive and believed these false things. And maybe you would get something like Pizzagate, or maybe you get something like January 6th. But largely, like these were kind of like self-contained. But now with this erosion of the norm of telling the truth among elites, politicians and candidates will pick up on this misinformation that they see online or that others show them, and they'll spread it to the whole country. And so all of a sudden you have Tucker Carlson amplifying this misinformation that used to just exist in these online echo chambers, and now everyone's seeing it. And so this is a huge problem that I think we're not talking about enough and not really studying enough right now as researchers. Okay, so before I talk about what to expect in the coming days and weeks, I just want to talk briefly about why people spread misinformation. And I think it's important to remember that, I think that we tend to demonize people who believe and spread misinformation, but I think we should actually have a little bit more sympathy for them. Like, yes, do they believe in something that's not true? Yeah, absolutely. Are they being told things by others that are not true? Yeah. And so I think we just need to think a little bit more about why people believe and share these things. So one reason, a big reason, goes back to what Professor Grunendijk was talking about, which is political tribalism, having this identity, right? You want to believe things and share things that are going to support your identity. It makes you feel good about yourself. It makes you feel good to put the other side down, right? So this is a big reason. No one's sharing misinformation to support the other political side of the aisle, right? Like everyone is trying to support their own team. Another is that people vary a lot in what we call digital literacy. I mean, like we in this room might be pretty good at using social media and kind of understanding what's real and what's fake. But look around your Thanksgiving table, right? Not everyone, knows a lot about this, and sometimes they kind of get swept up and they think that something's real and it's not. So sometimes people are just unable to detect falsehoods. And then sometimes they're able to detect falsehoods, but they're just not paying attention, right? Like social media, it's like a slot machine. Everything's competing for your attention. They want you to stay on there and look at 1,000 things, interact with 1,000 things. They're not particularly incentivized to get you to pay attention to things that are true, right? Social media companies don't have an incentive to do that. And so social media is a very distracting environment, and you might not be focusing on what's real. And I think that's something that's not being talked enough about, and I alluded to this before, is just trust, right? Like how many of us actually understand or have firsthand knowledge of economic data, right? Like monthly jobs reports. Like we trust those numbers, right? Because these elites are telling us how the economy is doing. How many of us are going to go to every single polling station in the US on Tuesday and look for examples of fraud, right? We're trusting elites who are telling us oftentimes inaccurate information, right? And so I just think that it's so easy to demonize the other side, and Professor Grunendijk was talking about this as well. These misperceptions we have about the other side, those people are often acting in good faith and they're just being fed garbage. And so I just think we need to remember that a lot of this just comes down to trust. Okay, and I'll just wrap up with one more slide, which is what to look out for on Election Day, right? And I think that we're going to see 3 types of misinformation being spread. One is we're going to have a lot of photos and videos of irregular voting experiences. So people going to the polls, taking videos, saying, oh, why is this person in line? This person, look, you can see them here in this frame. You can see them 30 minutes later, they're voting twice. I think we're going to see a lot of that. The Trump campaign is putting a record number of poll watchers, just volunteers to go and record what's happening at these polling sites. So I think you're going to see a lot of video and pictures, and some of this is going to be misrepresented. Another is reports of fraud. So we saw this a lot, especially in Georgia in 2020. Just reports of people not counting the ballots accurately and taking videos out of context. It's not to say that fraud never happens, But the kind of, the scale of the fraud that I think that there's going to be claims about is something that doesn't typically happen in US elections. And then the third thing that we're definitely going to see is false narratives about the timing of the election results. So Democrats tend to live in more urban areas, in cities, and it takes a really, really long time to count all the votes in Philadelphia or New York City, right? So these votes are added to the running tally that these news organizations are reporting on way later in the night. What happens instantly are all of these votes being counted in more rural Republican-leaning districts. And so you're going to see that the map looks really, really good for Trump at like 9 p.m., right? Right when all these election results are coming in. And then you're going to see an influx of Democratic votes, and there's going to be narratives like there were in 2020, in 2016, about how there's some kind of fraud going on. Democrats realize that they're losing, and now they're going to throw, they're going to fraudulently, beef up the numbers for them. So these are just things to keep an eye out for. Yeah, so I'll end with that.
Yeah, so, and that's one of the things we want you to sort of think about is give you stuff to look for on election night. This is so that you have a very reasoned view of what's going on. It could be a little chaotic, might I say. We're not anticipating that, but it could happen. So our next speaker is Professor Steph DeMora, who is, studies getting out the vote efforts. And this is back to who's going to show up on Tuesday.
Hi, everybody. I'm here with your daily dose of encouragement. So there's a lot of talk out there right now and here today about voter turnout. So first of all, let's get it out of the way. What exactly does that mean? When we talk about voter turnout, we're just talking about the number of people who show up and cast a vote at any point during the election. We're not looking for who you vote for, just how many people show up and vote for anybody. And this is important because voter turnout isn't just some arbitrary number or just because I like to see big numbers, but it's because voter turnout is a gauge of the health of our democracy. So to give you some context, over 136 million people voted in the 2016 presidential election. That's 59.2% of all eligible voters. Fast forward to 2020, and that number jumped to over 158 million, 65.9% of all eligible voters. This kind of high turnout shows that people felt the stakes were quite high. They were motivated to participate in our democratic process, and you can see, compared to the last several decades, that this is record-breaking. But how do we get there? How do we get people to think that their vote counts, that it means something? That's where candidates, campaigns, many different organizations come in. His group works really tirelessly to increase voter registration way before the election and then turnout right now. So for instance, 1 in 5 nonprofits is actively working to engage new voters in America. They sort of recognize that democracy works best when as many voices as possible are represented, and they know that getting people to the polls isn't always super easy for so many of the reasons that my colleagues have already mentioned. So I want to go over a few different efforts being undertaken to mobilize and get people to the polls right this second. There's so many organizations that do great work, and a lot of it is pretty fun and innovative. One of them is Unidos US. They're the largest Latino civil rights organization in the US, and through their Latino Votes initiative, they focus specifically on registering and mobilizing Latino voters. This group historically has had lower voter turnout. Through their registration drives, they've estimated they've registered about 1 million Latino voters, and through their Get Out the Vote campaigns, they've reached over 500,000 voters in each of the last 2 consecutive election cycles. So this outreach helps bridge the gap for Latino communities who might otherwise be underrepresented. Here's another, Ask Every Student, very similar, but they're focused on making sure students are ready and registered to vote. They've partnered with universities at over 38 different states, plus Washington, D.C., I believe, to ensure that students have, every student has a chance that they're asked, reminded, and encouraged to participate in politics. This is especially crucial because we know that young people don't often turn out in very high numbers. Seniors in high school turning 18 before the election or college students voting for the first time can often feel a bit disconnected to politics. This group did a bunch of research and found that actually some mobilization attempts make these young people scared because it's so important. They think it's a complicated thing to do, to register to vote and to go out and vote. And so slowly but surely, Ask Every Student is working to change that. VoteRev is another group whose entire mission is sort of focused around getting out the vote. They're constantly innovating and changing their approach, but right now they're doing a lot of peer-to-peer, friend-to-friend messaging with personalized sort of texts or even letters in the mail to encourage people to vote. Through those peer communications alone, they've sent reminders to over 250,000 people. And the peer-to-peer approach just makes voting feel more personal and accessible, reminding people that their friends and family are also doing this. They're also taking part in our civic duty to vote. But again, coming back to why it all matters, because higher voter turnout reflects a healthier democracy, like I said, when more people vote, we get a clearer picture of what the entire population wants, what you all want as young people, as students. It makes our government more representative and in turn more legitimate. If you think about it, the government should sort of ideally reflect the views and the needs of everybody, but if only a small percentage of eligible voters are actually voting, then a big chunk of society isn't being heard. High turnout means that we get a more accurate, inclusive reflection of public opinion. So representation and legitimacy are key here. Elected officials, again, supposed to represent all of us, not just a small slice. So again, when voter turnout is high, it means officials theoretically more accountable to a wider range of people, more likely to address a wider range, a more diverse range of issues. When it's low, it often means that voices of marginalized groups, young people, minorities, low-income groups, are sort of drowned out. So that's why all of the organizations that I talked about are working so hard to ensure that all voices are present in the voting booth. And we can get even more specific about the problems of low voter turnout. Young people, for instance, turn out about 10 points lower than older people. Turnout rates among people of color tend to be lower than white people. Low income groups turn out at lower rates than wealthier Americans. These groups also tend to have different opinions than those who actually turn out to vote. And they differ on a bunch of things from taxes to healthcare to foreign policy. And so with this in mind, there are a few other efforts that I think really deserve highlighting. And I want to mention the specifics of what they're doing because it's kind of fun in the way they're innovating, creating local meaning, so immediate impacts out of national level politics. The first one's Washington Can, or Community Action Network. They're a local example where their core mission is to increase voter turnout in Washington state. And they do this primarily through door-to-door canvassing, and they're working to engage residents face-to-face. So these people go, they knock on your door, they say, can we count on you to vote? And in that conversation, they bring these national politics very locally. They work a lot around Seattle, and they make it relevant to that community specifically. Local initiatives like this are crucial because they make voting accessible and also very relevant. When people see that the impact of their vote in their own communities, they're also more likely to turn out. This is a bunch of the canvassers as of just a few days ago, looking very excited. Black Girls Vote is another organization doing essential work focusing on voter turnout in Black communities, particularly among Black women. They run Get Out the Vote efforts like Party at the Mailbox, which provides reminders and community engagement, both in person and by mail, through voting parties, through celebrations of the Black community, getting people really excited and joyful about voting. And their mission is to make sure that these communities know that their votes matter. Right now, they're really targeting Black women to go and mobilize others. They recognize the power of activating that voter base. They found it to be very effective in the past, so that's what they're doing right now. I also just heard that they hit a bunch of high schools in Baltimore yesterday and today to educate students, Black students, and get them excited about registering and voting. Then, this is the last group I'm going to talk about, Asian American Futures. This group spent months and months and months and months and months getting up to date on best practices for getting out the vote. And they did their own fact finding. They found that young Asian Americans in their communities were often frustrated by some of the mobilization attempts. They felt it was a little bit patronizing. And so they designed and implemented their own postcards. You can see here it has some kind of typical Asian American foods on a table. There's a hot pot in the middle being shared by a multitude of hands. At the top it says, "Are you voting?" On the back there's a social pressure message. And it says, while who you vote for is private, if you vote or not, whether you vote or not, is public information in an attempt to mobilize this group in a powerful way. But it's not all super smooth sailing. There are challenges to increasing voter turnout that I think my colleagues have probably largely covered. But just to reiterate, it does matter. This is how we as a society get to say, what we want, what we value, who we want to lead us. When we show up on election day, it's not really just about filling out bubbles on a paper, but it's about having a voice and participating in something much bigger. I know this election season, we can feel a bit overwhelmed and cynical about the process, maybe a little bit freaked out. But I hope that learning about the work that all these groups are doing is encouraging. And I'm about to hit you with a bunch of numbers and then I'll be done. But according to the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, about half of all youth voted in 2020, which was an 11-point increase from 2016. According to TargetSmart, since 2022, 17.8 million people have newly registered to vote. Early voting has already begun. New York City saw the largest turnout for the first day of early voting ever. 140,000 people voted on day one. As of last night, that number was almost 500,000 people casting ballots in New York City alone. And then according to University of Florida's election lab, they estimated over 50 million voters have already cast a ballot in the US, which is almost a third of the total 2020 election turnout. So while the composition of all those early votes can't really tell us who's going to win, and I'm certainly not going to try to tell you that, it does tell us that many, many people are exercising their right to vote and making sure their voices are heard. I am encouraged by that, and I hope that you are too. And with that, I will pass it on.
And I think some people believe, we don't know. Those polls are so close that a lot may depend on who turns out next week. So just keep that in mind. How many of you have been contacted by someone to turn out to vote? Small handful. How many of you actually did get out to vote? Did anyone work? A few people. So we have this activity going on right here. It's going to be critical, I think, to see. We expect maybe high turnout, but who turns out is going to be very, very important next Tuesday. So we'll have some concluding comments from Professor Stanley Feldman.
So I just want to say a few things to prepare you for what you should or could expect to happen as you're watching the results of the election come in next Tuesday night. So you might grab some dinner, sit down, maybe turn on the TV, and think, I'm going to stay awake and wait to see who's elected president. And finally, nothing happens, and so you finally say, I'm going to go to sleep. And then you wake up Wednesday morning and you think, I'm going to turn on the news and find out who won the election, and you find out it's still not decided yet. And so I'll just remind you that 4 years ago, the major news organizations didn't declare a winner of the election until midday on Saturday, right? How was that possible? So to show you why that was possible and what might happen next week, let's take a look at the results from 4 years ago to see how it took so long for the outcome to be decided. So first, popular vote. Okay, that looks pretty clear cut. Biden had a approximately 7 million vote margin over Donald Trump in the popular vote. But as you know, for president in the United States, the popular vote doesn't matter at all because the outcome of the presidential election is decided in the Electoral College. So let's look at the Electoral College vote. And okay, that looks like a pretty clear-cut victory. 306 Electoral College votes for Biden, 232 for Trump. How was this not decided quickly? Well, what you're not seeing here is that this margin in the Electoral College really disguised what was a number of very close races in key states. And so these are 6 states, 6 of the states that were closest in outcome 4 years ago. Joe Biden won 5 of those 6 states, which was the margin that you saw in the Electoral College vote. But if you look at the numbers, right, just look at how close the elections were in these states. Arizona, 49.4% for Joe Biden, 49% for Donald Trump. Wisconsin, 49.4% for Joe Biden, 48.8% for Donald Trump. If you're trying to do the math to figure out what the margins were, that's what the margins looked like, right? They were tiny, right? With the exception of Michigan, right? The outcomes in the other 5 close states were in the tens of thousands, right? Little over 10,000 votes margin in Arizona, a little under 12,000 vote margin in Georgia, 20,000 vote margin in Wisconsin, right? So what we see is that even though Biden won 5 of those 6 states, which gave him a fairly comfortable margin in the Electoral College outcome, the margins within those states were really tiny. So let's play a what if, right? What if things had been slightly different 4 years ago, and say that Donald Trump had won Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, all right? So let's flip those 3 states red, right? That would have given Donald Trump 47 more Electoral College votes, and he would have won the election. But if you look at the votes that would have done that, right? Votes that would have had to change in just Arizona, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, the total is a little over 100,000 votes, about 103,000 votes, right? A change in 103,000 votes in those 3 states would have swung the election from Biden to Trump. It's 103,000 votes out of over 150 million votes cast in the country, right? To give you a sense of how small that number is, there are football stadiums in colleges in the US that will seat 100,000 people, right? Right? That's the numbers that we're talking about. So what we were looking at 4 years ago was Biden victories in states that were so tiny that it just takes a long time to get those votes counted. Let me give you one other what if, right? So suppose that 4 years ago, Donald Trump had won Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, right? So now we'll flip those 3 states red. Okay. That would have only required a little over 40,000 votes to change, a little over 40,000 votes. And if you add up the numbers, assuming that that had been the outcome 4 years ago, the result would have been Biden 269 electoral votes, Trump 269 electoral votes, and the Electoral College outcome would have been tied, right? Something that we haven't seen in the US for almost 200 years, right? So the point is that one of the things that the Electoral College does as a means of electing the president is that it focuses, right, the result on potentially very thin margins in a handful of states, right? You're not going to be sitting around wondering what the outcome in New York is going to be, or what the outcome in California is going to be, or what the outcome in Mississippi or Alabama is going to be. You're going to be wondering what's happening in Pennsylvania, and what's happening in Michigan, and what's happening in Arizona, and what's happening in Georgia. And if the election is anything like it was 4 years ago, if the polls are reasonably accurate that this is a very close election, then you're going to be sitting there waiting for mail-in ballots to be counted. You can be sitting there waiting for ballots from Americans living abroad to be counted. You're going to be looking at a lot of double checking of votes, and don't be at all surprised if once again, for some of these states, it takes several days before the votes are counted and certified and we know the outcome. And let's hope that we don't end up in a very close election with a tied electoral college. It's very unlikely, but not impossible. And that gets us into a situation that we are completely unprepared for. Leaving that aside, as you see, there's a very good chance that we're going to be sitting there waiting for votes to be counted, in some cases very slowly, and in some states, margins that are very small. The other implication of this is that these margins make it more possible that people will claim that there's fraud or some other election malfeasance, because it's hard to say that 7 million vote margin was somehow tainted, but a 10,000 vote margin, a 12,000 vote margin, all right, that's more difficult. In any respects, get your bags of chips out, plan to spend a long night. You may likely go to bed Tuesday night without being certain who the winner is, and we just all are in the same boat and have to wait for the outcome.
Okay, how's that for sobering information? And tragically, the longer the delay to, the more misinformation is able to spread. So this is the other thing to watch out for. Those of you who've taken news literacy classes know how to check the veracity of the news that you're getting. Make sure that you're distinguishing between false information and information that's been verified, because I think if it goes as we're thinking it might, there's a lot of room here for people to spread negative, bad information that will make people upset and believe that this election has been stolen one way or another. So we have to really worry about this. So try to stay calm, don't panic during this process. We're political scientists, we try to analyze things, think about it in a rational, objective fashion. And we're hoping for the best. Keep your eye on North Carolina, that when the polls will close early in North Carolina. If there's a clear signal there, then maybe we're not in the kind of mess that we're suggesting. And the same, I guess, what time does Pennsylvania close? Is it also 7 or 8?
North Carolina closes 7:30, Pennsylvania
Yeah, so 7:38, around 7:38, we're going to get, either we're going to know it's a mess and things are too close and no one's willing to say anything, or you might get a signal of how the evening is going to go, or the next week is going to go. So now I'd like to open it up for questions. We have speakers down here, microphones down here. So please come up, anything is on the table. If you have a question about any aspect of what's being covered here, and the question can be directed to anyone. Don't be shy, but I know you've got a lot of political science majors out there interested in this. Yeah. Professor Rose, please.
Hello, I'm Professor Rose. I would like to ask the first question. My question is for Professor Engelhardt. A lot of the explanation as to why polls have been wrong in the past is the silent majority, the self-censoring. Ooh, is that me? No. The self-censoring of Trump voters. And so what's your assessment of whether, of how powerful you think that will be in affecting the outcome?
So one of the questions that we always have, right, is like you get, I don't know, texted, called on the phone, an email, et cetera, asking you to offer your opinions. We're always wondering, are people actually telling the truth, right? This shy Trump voter phenomenon, for instance, was a big part in trying to explain the 2016 polling error. The Professional Organization of Public Opinion kind of like researchers, American Association of Public Opinion Research, APOR, since at least 2016, but probably before then, has done these like after action reports trying to figure out why polls have been wrong. They couldn't find any evidence or any clear evidence that there was this big kind of like mixed community of kind of people who were not willing to say that they were going to vote for Trump, but then in the ballot box, because they are like privately sharing their opinions, they're then voting. There are different strategies for testing this. One is known as a like list experiment, basically saying like, here are 4 statements, how many of these statements are true of you? And then on a random basis, somebody gets that list, another group of people get another list, and one of the differences between the lists is I support Donald Trump, right? There's not really any evidence people were kind of like guarding their opinions. And then that kind of shy Trump voter phenomenon existed as a question in 16, not much evidence there, and now this is the 3rd cycle with him on the ballot. I'm not entirely sure that people would be hesitant to offer that opinion. The big question though, and it's actually a question that a lot of folks have been asking of kind of like choices that public pollsters have been doing this cycle, is just making sure that we get people who support Donald Trump to actually answer polls, right? If we take seriously Trump's rhetoric about saying things about like deep state, et cetera, that there's like, this has been translated into questions about just like trust in pollsters. Why offer my opinion to somebody who's gonna mischaracterize my words, right? So one of the questions isn't so much, are the people who say that, are they going to tell the truth to the pollster? It's just like, are they actually even answering the polls in the first place? So attempts this cycle to address this have been doing what I've described, right, as statistical weighting to, and using basically, do we have enough people in our poll who said that they voted for Trump in 2020? Because we know what that vote share looked like. We can adjust our polls this cycle to look like that, but there's a lot of debate over whether or not this is actually an appropriate thing to do. So to tie everything together, there is a question, for instance, of like, are we getting the right estimates? But it's less about people telling the truth and more about like, are they even talking to us?
Thank you. So yes, please.
Hi, sorry. I forgot your name, the professor at the very...
Professor Demora.
Oh, hi, Professor Demora. So I think this is applicable for everyone, but I think it's more so applicable to what you presented. I'm always very interested by like the voter turnout campaigns, because the first thought that kind of comes to my mind is, you know, even in the instance that we do get much more voters than we have like in the past years, why is like the focus kind of much more so on voter numbers than like election policy literacy? Because now the question is, oh yes, we do have these massive amount of voters, but to what extent what percentage of these voters, you know, really have a comprehension of economic policy? What a percentage of these voters understand that, you know, a big percentage in one poll might equal a small percentage in another poll, right? To what extent, why isn't kind of, are there any campaigns or like, why isn't the focus more so on election and policy literacy so that the Americans who are voting aren't just doing it based off of, you know, an Instagram, TikTok reel, which unfortunately is a lot of the information that young people are receiving these days. So like, to kind of sum up, I guess what I'm asking is, are there campaigns who are focused more so about election literacy, and why isn't the focus more so about, you know, long form content and policy literacy over just numbers?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Thanks for asking it. There are certainly many, many organizations focused on political literacy. I think we as political science professors try to do the bulk of that perhaps, but there are still many organizations that dip into education about specific policy. The organizations that I presented today, and probably that you're most familiar with, typically are nonpartisan. So their focus is sort of like, we do a lot of our fundraising, we want to make sure we're not explicitly supporting one candidate or another, and so they try to shy away from educating on specific policy points. And that's particularly true for, I think, all of the organizations that I talked about and all of their methods. But that doesn't mean that educational organizations don't exist. They certainly do. I just don't work with them as much directly, given my research on turnout specifically. But yeah, they're out there. They're not as many for that reason.
Would, I'm so sorry. Professor Bryan, would you like perhaps know about any specific campaigns, since your work is specifically about like misinformation?
Would I what?
Would you more know about like any specific campaigns dedicated towards like election and politics literacy, since your like presentation was about misinformation and whatnot?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so like there's two things that happen during campaigns, right? There's like persuasion to vote, and then there's persuasion to choose a candidate, right? And that maybe you have people who are just trying to improve political knowledge in general, like economic policies, like you mentioned, and I guess that falls more in the persuasion camp. There's always all these calls to increase, our knowledge of civics, right? We should have like mandatory high school civics class, right? And this stuff doesn't really come up that much in campaigns. It's not about trying to teach people enough about foreign policy so that they realize which candidate aligns with their foreign policy attitudes and preferences. It's really just about like throwing the kitchen sink at these voters and trying to throw every argument at them to elect one candidate or to get out the vote. And I mean, one thing that Professor DeMora was talking about, get out the vote campaigns, often those campaigns, like there's a mix, there's some like interplay between the persuasion and the turnout goals, right? Like a lot of these get out the vote organizations are actually partisan in that they want to get out the vote in very specific places, right? They're not like, a Democratic group is not trying to get out the vote in like rural Alaska, right? And so there is some interplay, but yeah, there's not as much focus on like civics education and just trying to increase general political knowledge during the campaign. So.
Thank you.
That is such an important question. I mean, democracy was really designed for something other than humans, because humans actually don't have all that much time to learn all of the information that they're supposed to have for an election, and so we kind of muddle through democracy, basically. We urge you to tell your friends to take political science. It's a great major for anyone who wants to learn more about politics and information. So we're always on that bandwagon. So we encourage you. So do we have other questions? Yeah, please. But yeah, keep pushing political science.
So this is a question regarding polarization, right? We live in an era where people trust mainstream media less and less. And as you guys mentioned, that elites can just lie. They can just say whatever they want. So how exactly do you combat polarization from a systemic level? How exactly do you solve this problem? What can you actually do?
Yeah, so this is a great question and a really big one, and one of the main things that political scientists are wrestling with right now. So part of it, it's funny, I was going to say something to the last question that relates to this, which is, one of the big challenges is there are plenty of people out there trying to offer helpful information in a variety of ways, right? Help people to understand politics. But one of the things that's changed is the choice environment, right? It used to be that, we had three, this is quite a while back, but, we had three news networks and everyone would sit down at 6 o'clock and they would watch the 6 o'clock news with their family. And there were no other options, right? Nobody had a cell phone. And in those days, which are sort of the sort of good old days that people often look back to when they're thinking about American politics, right? Another way it used to work is that there was sort of a base level of knowledge that people would get about politics. And if something happened, like someone told some huge lie, everyone would get that information. But the problem is now that people can so easily select out of those environments, particularly news environments, that they no longer get those messages. So it's very hard to deliver a message to someone, whether it's about, you know, how to think about tax policy, or it's, hey, someone told a huge lie and it's incorrect. It's just very hard to reach the people who aren't motivated to get it, right? So we have this thing where the people who are, you know, there are people who are really engaged in politics and know, you know, all the details about everything, but then there's this huge swath of the electorate that needs the information desperately, but it's just very hard for them to reach. So in political science, we know, for instance, that one of the things I was going to mention, ran out of time, but is that, or we think we know, is that if you correct misinformation, it actually does matter. It does help a lot, particularly when it comes to information about the other side, because that prevents these spirals where people become more and more cynical about what's going on, and they say, well, if the other side is going to overthrow democracy, then I guess I might as well overthrow it for, or, you know, or if the other side doesn't believe in democracy, why should I, right? So you get these concerning spirals, but potentially at least. But if you can correct that information, people say, oh, actually, the other side's not so bad after all. My stereotypes were incorrect, and they become much less likely to believe those things themselves. So there's some hope.
Thank you.
Well, I had two thoughts. Like, well, I thought of Pennsylvania doesn't count till it closes, I guess, right? And then, but a question or related to that graph when you showed when division started increasing, and I felt like I was going to name drop, and I'm not that knowledgeable on all this, but like, didn't Newt Gingrich have like a strategy at that time that vitriol would be successful for winning? That was my question.
Yeah, so there are a number of factors that sort of correspond to when things started spreading out, and that is one of the theories that after 1994, the Gingrich takeover, that started a lot of this thing. This Sean Theorold at the University of Texas has a book about this that it sounds like you might be familiar with. But there were a lot of other things happening too, and I mean a big part of this was sorting too. That there was sort of a potential for Republicans to make inroads in the South that they hadn't recognized before. The Democratic Party had dominated the South for many, many, many years because of the strength of party identification and this idea that Democratic Party is the party of the South since the Civil War, right? And then little by little, especially after the 1960s, Republicans started to recognize, oh, actually, there are a lot of people in the South who we might be able to appeal to on a variety of issues, and they started appealing more to them. So part of what Gingrich did was make changes to the culture in Washington and some of the rules for, you know, how long the Congressional work week was, that influenced like how well people knew each other, and there were some sort of important cultural things that he did in Washington. But another thing that he did before that was really go out and actually recruit legitimate candidates or quality candidates that had a chance of winning in the South, and actually make an effort in the South that really hadn't been made up to that point in time. So yeah, Gingrich is a really important player for a variety of reasons, I would say.
Anyone else? But I would say the kind of insults that we're seeing, the kind of accusations from political leaders does not promote a decrease in polarization. And we're seeing this more on one side than the other in this campaign. Insulting the other side is a surefire way to increase polarization. So we would like to see less name calling, I think, in general, among our politicians. They are not setting us a good example, to say the least. And using the word garbage, which came up earlier, that we've all been hearing about, is certainly not a good way to improve relations between groups in the two parties. Anyone else? Got someone over here? Yeah, yeah.
My question is, okay, that's loud. My question is for Professor Feldman. So Annika and I are both from Minnesota, so we've seen the way that Tim Walz has had his impact in both the Democratic and the Republican Party. So my question is, how do you think his impact will traverse in its surrounding states like Michigan and Wisconsin?
So,
I know that typically in most elections, the VP pick is not on a lot of people's forefront, but I think in this election, we've seen something very, very different. So my question is, how do you see that happening with Tim Walz?
quite sure how to answer that.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, here we got Professor Klein here. He'll answer, yeah.
So, I mean, I guess the first thing to note is that, I mean, there's very little evidence, at least in past elections, that the vice presidential candidate has much of an effect on really anything. Now, I mean, what you're saying is, well, maybe this time it's different. So possibly, right? I mean, that was, I guess, part of the logic was to pick Walz because he sort of might be able to appeal to some swing voters in kind of the Midwest. I mean, Minnesota is not really close, so that's not, but like Wisconsin is next door. But I'm not sure what evidence we've seen that would show that that's happening, I guess. But possibly, I don't know. He did do the Twitch thing or something, so maybe that convinced some young people or something, but.
They're just,
Yeah, so I mean, JD Vance, also, I mean, you could make the argument, I guess, that because Trump is very old, JD Vance becomes more important, just actuarially speaking, I guess. But, I mean, again, I'm not sure if there's any evidence that we've seen that there's much of an effect, I think. I don't know.
If Harris had chosen Shapiro, would this race be over?
I don't think so, because again, I mean, he's popular, I don't know, yeah. Anyway.
The only other thing to keep in mind is that if we're really looking at razor-thin margins, right? It's hard to know how to predict something like that, right? You know, that's the problem of trying to overanalyze these elections, right? Because who knows, somebody wakes up election day and something pops into their head and all of a sudden they decide who they're going to vote for that day. You know, in an election that isn't very close, that doesn't matter. In an election where we're talking about, you know, relatively modest number of votes, tiny little factors, right, can matter in ways that are just very difficult to understand. The best example is go back to 2016, that really close election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. People were pointing to all sorts of things that caused Clinton to lose the election. We can go through a laundry list of them. Just almost impossible, I think, to point to one thing that made the difference. Maybe something did, but it's very difficult on those margins to be able to say anything. Vice presidents, normally the answer is probably nothing, but maybe it's not zero.
So one thing that's I think worth adding, or just making sure that it's clear, is voters are actually fairly predictable, right? We can predict the vast majority of voters with pretty strong accuracy way out in advance. The trick is just that when it's this close, you can predict voters, it's just very hard to predict the winner when it's this close. So usually vice presidents don't really matter very much, but in this election, if somebody sneezes, it might change the outcome of the election.
I guess I just want to follow up on that. I'm thinking about the.
This, by the way, is Professor Lahav
Yes.
from political
Another
science.
political scientist with a question. Wouldn't you say that depending on the controversial nature of the vice president, for example, I'm thinking about Sarah Palin, didn't she cost McCain? That was quite a bit hefty cost. So my thought is that as Waltz was chosen, because he's not a controversial figure, thinking about the alternative might have really caused a lot more diversion, picking Shapiro, for example. That's one of my thinking about the VP, which goes back to the question.
Maybe it's like, you want to control what you can control.
Yeah.
And then I'm also struggling to think about having Shapiro go to, say, a University of Michigan football game, which Tim Walz did, or I'm struggling to see Shapiro do a Twitch video game thing when one of Walz's things is I got rid of my Sega because I was playing it too much, right? So even if they themselves aren't doing anything, a lot of the campaign strategy is where do they kind of fit in?
One thing that's important, big picture thing that's worth mentioning that political scientists have researched quite a bit is that in the old days, right, so a lot of this logic of well, should we pick Shapiro, comes from this idea that picking a candidate strategically from a particular state is going to help to win that state. And which still, obviously there's a logic to that, but that logic made a lot more sense in the old days when politics was more local and people were bringing home pet projects to their states, and people in politics wasn't so nationalized, right? Now people are voting Republican and Democrat in their local elections and thinking about abortion policy or foreign policy when they're voting for the dog catcher, right? It wasn't like that before. It used to be much more performance-based. So if you could get a candidate that was beloved in their own state, people from both parties would vote for them. But that was in the days when people crossed the aisle to vote for the other party. So these days, it's much less likely that I think that sort of strategic decision is going to matter when it comes to picking someone from a particular state.
And I'm sure we're going to see whoever loses is going to come up with, there's going to be a lot of analysis at the end of this, and there'll be thousands of reasons why people won or lost. It's our job as political scientists to try and figure that out. So another thing to look for on election night is the exit polls. The exit polls, we haven't really talked about them, but they're done by the networks, major news organizations, asking voters some questions, some of the reasons. Who are they? Why did they vote the way they did? It starts to give us some glimpse into the reasoning of voters on the two sides. And that's what you'll hear a lot of throughout the evening, because there isn't a whole lot more to talk about. So the networks pay for this to give them something to chat about for hours while we're trying to figure out what's going to happen. So pay attention to that. We've obviously set some fantastically interesting themes in this election. One is the gender gap, right? If you've been following the polls, the gender gap is historically large. The Trump campaign has been doing a lot to appeal to male voters. If you look on TikTok, you'll see a lot of appeal to young men with popular male influences on TikTok. If you look at the Harris TikTok feed, it's a lot of women. There's a lot of discussion of reproductive rights, a lot of attention to young women. So I think you can start to look for issues like that. We've obviously heard a lot about immigration. That will definitely be a key theme in this election. So try to put your thinking caps on, analyst caps on, to, as you're watching, don't just start crying or overdoing whatever you're doing. Start to think, why is this happening? What's going on in this country? Why are people, what are they thinking about? Why are people in one state going one way and some another? As Professor Grundy says, a lot of it is about partisanship. At least 90-something% of voters are already squared away because they're Republicans or Democrats. But there are people, as you were mentioning, who don't know anything, and they've decided, I'm going to go and vote, and I have no idea. So maybe the last thing that they saw on TikTok will be the thing that determines their vote. And these are the people, these are the 100,000 people who, in certain states, who are determining the outcome of our election. I don't mean to depress you overly, but so try to have thinking caps on election night, start to look at the polls. What are the things that people are saying in terms of why people are going for Trump or Harris? And this will give you some analytic framework to understand what's happened. We assume there will be another election, no matter which way it goes. We'll be there to fight another day. That's what democracy is all about. So, and I wanted to thank you again for coming. This has been great. Thanks very much.